Today, the UN is warning that the escalating violence between Hamas and Israel could escalate into, their words, full-scale war. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called a state of emergency in the city of Walid near Tel Aviv. You can take a look at this footage here, and we're seeing so much of this. The sky lighting up with incoming rocket fire and Israeli anti-missile defense, the Iron Dome system. This was the heaviest offensive between Israel and Hamas since a 2014 war in Gaza. President Trump issuing a statement on the ongoing violence, slamming President Biden, quote, "When I was in office, Israel's adversaries knew there would be a swift retribution if Israel was attacked. Under Biden, the world is getting more violent and more unstable because of Biden's weakness." But a lot of the media and the left are blaming Israel and not Hamas for this escalation. American lawmakers specifically calling out Benjamin Netanyahu as if he's the one pushing the button on these rockets. This is from Senator Bernie Sanders. Quote, "Once again, we're seeing how the irresponsible actions of government-allied right-wing extremists in Jerusalem can escalate quickly into devastating war. The United States must call for an immediate ceasefire and an end to the provocative and illegal settlement activity." Sanders went on to add that, quote, "We must also recommit to working with Israelis and Palestinians to finally end this conflict." And then there was this cartoon, which was circulated by a lot of the media. It comes to us from a feminist whose name is Anita Sarkeesian. By the way, she's also on Time's list of the 100 most influential people in America. But take a look here. It's two women sitting down having coffee, casual conversation. One woman asks, "Israel isn't a country?" Question mark. The other woman replies, "No, they're a settler colony." And then she proceeds to explain what that means. Basically, that Israel is colonizing Palestine, even though Palestine isn't a country. Twitter has not removed this from its platform, nor has it removed thousands of other overtly anti-Semitic tweets. We want to talk more about this and the way this story is portrayed here in this country with Tennessee Congressman David Kustoff. Congressman Kustoff represents Tennessee's 8th District. Also with us, Harvard Law Professor Emeritus and Newsmax analyst Alan Dershowitz. And Walid Phares is here. He's a PhD in foreign relations and widely cited on foreign affairs and Middle Eastern affairs. Gentlemen, great to have you all with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Dershowitz, I want to start with you in that infographic or whatever you want to call it that went viral yesterday. And I think it's pretty indicative of the way the left and a lot of the media tends to portray this issue as Israel has no right to be there, and that there's a moral equivalency between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government and Hamas.
Well, it must be true because it's on Twitter. Twitter hasn't taken it down. We know Twitter takes down all false tweets. We know it took down the President of the United States. And so if it keeps this up, if it doesn't take it down, Twitter must be saying it's true. Now, that's the basic problem with partial censorship. That is, when you take some things down and leave other things down, you create the absolute false impression that the things you've kept up is true. So the most untrue thing on Twitter is its own policy.
Right.
Its own policy of essentially sending a message saying if we've kept it up, it must be true. They are conveying false information. Obviously, Israel is a country. It's as much of a country as the United States and New Zealand and Canada and any other country. Israel is comprised of Jews mostly that had a country 2,000 years ago. They were thrown out of the country. They then in 1848, there was a majority of Jews living in Jerusalem. This is not a colonialist enterprise. This is national liberation movement supported by the United States, supported by the world in 1948. And the world continues to support it, except for the hard left, OAC, Sanders, you name it. And they're encouraging the violence. They're telling Hamas, if you rocket cities like Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and Israel fights back, we'll get the world to condemn Israel. So keep doing it. And that's the basic message.
Yeah, that's the message. And, so much of this, until you are really kind of, read in on this topic, it is hard to pick up on so much of this, which is kind of folded into a lot of these stories. Just on that issue alone, Congressman, there is only one country, right, in this region, and that is Israel. Palestine is not a country. And, sometimes you would be hard-pressed to understand that from the way a lot of this is portrayed in the media.
There's no doubt about that. And thank you for having me on. It also depends on the message we send as a nation. And I think back, I was listening to what Professor Dershowitz said. just a couple of months before the election, I was in the Rose Garden when President Trump negotiated the peace deal between Israel and Bahrain and UAE. We sent messages to the Middle East, to Israel, to the rest of the world that we have Israel's back, and that Israel, without a doubt, is the leader of democracy in the Middle East. The difference is today, John, we're not sending that same message. We're not hearing that from the Biden administration. You had the tweet earlier from Bernie Sanders. When the rest of the world looks at Twitter and they see Bernie Sanders as a leader in the Senate, that's the takeaway. And so we've got to come out stronger and more definitive in support of our true ally, and that's Israel.
Walid, when you take a look at this situation and the way it is portrayed in the American media, obviously, someone who was born and raised in Lebanon, very, very well how these Iranian-backed groups can influence local politics. It's Hezbollah in Lebanon, it's Hamas in Gaza and the West Bank. And, how do you see the way this is portrayed by the American media? Is it a, both sides type issue? Is it portrayed fairly?
You actually began to answer it very well, that this is what we see, the chaos we see in the media, the national media. It's not just chaos, it's organized. There is a network behind it, both in the region and here in the United States and in Europe, that is trying to impose one version to the events. While in the region now, we have two theaters happening. One is in Jerusalem, demonstrations. Yes, they turn violent. The Israelis respond. But that's about an ethnic conflict, has to do with borders of the city and settlements and all that issue. It's not the only one in the world. There are dozens of them. But then there is something else, completely different. It's Hamas in Gaza that controls Gaza. It's a quasi-regime backed by Hezbollah, you just mentioned that, backed by the Iranian regime and funded by them. And what is the relationship between those events in Jerusalem and then Hamas suddenly unleashing rockets onto Israel? Well, the reason, in my view, is that the Iranians want to create more chaos as the Biden administration is negotiating the return to the Iran deal. So there is something much bigger and more ominous than just what you see.
Right, and that's another thing too, I think, and even I'm guilty of this sometimes, it gets lost, and this is really a proxy fight between Iran and Israel, and that's really what it cuts down to. And then, we also have the Democrats, Professor Dershowitz, where you have, duplicity coming from the leadership of the Democrats. Nancy Pelosi condemning Hamas, of course, says Israel has every right to defend itself, but she won't stand up to Ilhan Omar. And here's what she tweeted, quote, "Many will tell you that Israel has a right to defend itself to safety and security, but they're silent on whether Palestinians have those rights too. Until we defend the rights of Palestinians, just as we do Israelis, we have no leg to stand on when it comes to justice or peace." But nobody wants to hear this from Ilhan Omar. Nobody's listening to her.
Well, unfortunately, people are listening to her. She has a following on the hard left, on universities, among young people, among Democrats, and that has to be responded to, which is why I come on shows like this. I write my books. I have my talk show, my podcast, in order to fight back in the court of public opinion, because the case for Israel is a strong one. The case for Israel defending itself is a strong one. And we know that the more Hamas is rewarded for what it does in the international community, the more they'll do it. And so people like Sanders and others are actually encouraging violence by Hamas and should be condemned for it. And what they're doing is against American policy.
Right. And when I say that nobody's listening to Ilhan Omar, I'm talking about the people that are not already listening to her, the people that she's ostensibly trying to reach here when it comes to this. Rashida Tlaib's another one. Congressman, what is it like for you when you pass these women in the halls of Congress? You have to work with them, or supposed to be able to work with them. But, here's what Rashida Tlaib tweeted out. "When I was 7 years old, I first prayed at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's a sacred site for Muslims. This is the equivalent to attacking the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for Christians or the Temple on the Mount for Jews." Again, it's not the same. It's not the same because she doesn't have really the platform to be making this type of statement, considering the things she has said about Israel.
Well, you're exactly right. But the fact of the matter is, as Professor Dershowitz said a moment ago, that there are people who listen to her. There are young people that listen to both of them. And, clearly in the past, one or both have made anti-Semitic comments where their leadership, unfortunately, the Democratic leadership, would not dial them back. You know, you talk about cancel culture a lot. If one of my members were to make comments that were discriminatory, they would be reprimanded and maybe stripped of committee assignments. So it's clearly a double standard here. But, you know, make no mistake, elections have consequences. And so that's why so many of us are fighting so hard to get the majority back in November of next year so that we can have control of the committees. And again, we can send that message out to the rest of the world that the United States has the back of Israel.
You know, about a minute left, and I want to end on this. Professor Dershowitz and I have talked about this a lot, and, you know, we are just 239 days away from the signing of the Abraham Accords, and I posted that picture today and that statement. A lot of people said, well, you know, obviously it didn't last, it's falling apart, but this is what we see happen, isn't it, Professor Phares? You know, you reach a peace deal, but the Palestinians, they don't really want to let it take root. Those countries that we signed that peace deal with, you know, they are the only ones with really the governments and the moral authority in their own countries to try and forge ahead on a path to peace. There is nothing that doesn't exist in Gaza or the West Bank.
No, John, because Hamas is not part of the Abraham Accord. Hamas and Hezbollah and all their jihadi allies are part of the Iran axis in the region. Actually, if you're going to go quantitatively, well, Egypt alone is half of the Arab and Muslim world. It has Jordan, it has the UAE, it has Bahrain, indirectly Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Sudan. So the majority of Arab Muslims under the Abraham Accord are moderates, wants to move forward, and those who wants to sabotage it are the Iranian regime and their allies, Hamas, as we see it now.
Right, and that's what we see. This is the division in the Middle East, those that want to forge ahead with peace, and then there's Iran that clearly does not. Congressman Kustoff, great to see you. Professor Dershowitz, thank you as always, and Dr. Walid Phares, we appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much.
Hey, I'm Rob Finnerty. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please join the conversation in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, too. Hit the bell icon to be alerted to breaking news. And remember, there's a whole lot more on Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news network. Newsmax TV, where real news for real people.